think it's fabulous. What perfect time.
These provisions are about aging, but they're not just about aging.
It's really intended to cover this particular group of people who have long been neglected or forgotten.
In the future, having these clear rules can actually reduce the cost in the long run.
The legal breakthrough is to decouple legal protection and entitlement of various legal rights with the so-called employment relationship.
If, once I was in that category, if China offered me a great job, of course, I would take it up.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tuyun. Joining me to discuss China's first nationwide framework specifically designed to protect the rights of overage workers, Dr. Lauren Johnston, Senior Research Fellow, AustChina Institute, Melbourne, Australia. Mr. Bai Xianyue, partner of a Grandall law firm, Tianjin office, China, and Dr. Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics, Peking University, China. A warm welcome to you all. Well, let's first take a look at the background. Why has China introduced these provisions at this particular moment? Dr. Li Lun, can we start from you, please?
Yes, thanks for having me. So I think the timing is closely related to the demographic pressure. So as we know that, China is moving into a, aging society, and it's moving from a labor abundant economy to one where old workers, also in terms of technical experts and retirees, are going to be becoming a more and more important part of our labor supply. So it also follows this broader retirement age reform that began in 2025. So China is gradually rising this retirement age requirement over 15 years. So men, increasing from 60 to 63, women from 50 to 58. So I think before this framework, a lot of people who are employed after reaching their retirement age were treated as, kind of blurry or ambiguous relationship rather than a closely defined, labor contract. So basically that created a lot of uncertainty over their wages, their overtime payment, their workplace injury, and also how to, settle the dispute. So I think these provisions are about aging, but they're not just about aging. They're about how to regulate and bring a larger informal segment of the labor market into a clearer framework for regulatory purposes. So overall, this is reflecting a structural shift. People are living longer, but people still have the need or want to have a career or job, and also in terms of the labor income, and the law has to catch up with that reality.
Indeed, it provides more certainty for that group of people. Well, the provisions were first released for public consultation last July by the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security, together with the 4 other government agencies. They were formally issued in May and took effect on Wednesday. So, Xianyue, looking at that timeline, do you think the policy arrived to an extent later than it should have from a legal perspective? And has the transition from publication to implementation been somewhat rushed?
Well, that's an interesting question. I personally think this piece of regulation is kind of a piece of a puzzle that has long been missing in order to establish a comprehensive coverage of a legal protection regime for all those who work and participate or contribute to the economy, whatever minor aspect or insignificant role that might possibly be. The previous roles, did have something missing because they basically overlooked this group of overage people for many decades, simply because people nowadays are unlike several decades ago, as Professor Lee just mentioned. They live longer, they're healthier, and they're more willing and motivated to continue to work beyond retirement age. Over the years, because the overaged people, usually about 60, I would say, although now the retirement age has been increased to 63 and gradually over the next few years. So these overaged people, there are more and more of them are coming back to the employment market looking for a part-time or full-time job, aiming to have an extra paycheck. And this is something that's quite common these days. The challenge is many jobs involve, for example, risk many times industrial work-related jobs, etc. But the previous legislation or the rural regulation doesn't cover this group of people. So to a certain extent, you can say this came a bit late than what we would have wished. But I guess, the legislature probably, as it always, happens all the time, the legislature always comes later than what the social status or the social condition would involve. The pace is kind of always lagging behind for legislation. The point you mentioned, whether it's rushed or not, I think this is a kind of a catch-up work that we need to do. So I find it something that we've long expected, really, not something unexpected or came as a surprise.
Then why was it necessary for China to introduce a dedicated framework for overage workers instead of relying on existing labor laws? Just cover them with existing labor laws. Would that be fine? Can you further elaborate a little bit, Xianyue?
Well, as I said, there had been a conspicuous, unfortunate lacuna in the specific legal recourse, in terms of specific legal recourse for this group of people who are beyond the retirement age and who decides and, think it's beneficial to continue to remain in the workforce and continue to look for additional income to supplement what they have already. But the law and the legislation did not provide a specific legal protection that is dedicated to this group of people. So under previous employment legal regime, they are not officially or legally recognized as employees per se, in accordance with the labor law. So that means they are not a legitimate sort of a claimant, for example, when there's any labor dispute or salary or work-related injury, whatever. So they are very vulnerable to all types of ill treatment and unequal treatment. They are simply a workforce who work on a temporary or a one-off service basis. That is, most of the labor law provisions do not apply to them. So this is very unfortunate. And this piece of the regulation is really intended to cover this particular group of people who have long been neglected or forgotten in terms of law, legal protection. Yes.
To you, Lauren, how does your country protect the rights of these older workers? Is there a dedicated legal framework, or are they covered by existing labor laws?
I believe that there aren't specific provisions except to say that older workers can't be discriminated against. So that's a specific case of discrimination as compared to discrimination against women or minorities or so on. There is a category for age-based discrimination. And I think what's interesting in the case in China is, as I said, this much more recent surge in life expectancy. So now there are many more older workers. But what I think is really interesting about the timing is that it was just a week ago or 2 weeks ago that China introduced its mutual care provisions for population aging and for aged care, which basically mean that older people will take care of older people, or at least help to take care of them. So even just from a actual literal aged care perspective, there's going to be a lot more older workers. So I find it interesting that these rights would be introduced just literally weeks after that mutual care. So on the one hand, you have more older workers in the non-aged care labor market, but presumably there's going to be a massive increase in the number of older workers in aged care itself. So I think that kind of crossover timing is very interesting in China's case. But yeah, in Australia's case, it's as much about there's legal protections for discrimination against older workers. And I think all the other rights are wrapped into generic rights.
So in Australia, it's more focused on age discrimination instead of other rights.
Yes. Yeah. So because that's really the sort of main age-based factor. Like as long as you can do the job, then there's sort of not as many other reasons for age-based discrimination. So it's just to make sure that that all the other rights are the same. There's sort of no reason to have a special right for an older person.
So if those retired workers, they want to work afterwards and they want to protect their own rights, they refer to existing labor laws or?
In fact, I think Australia has no retirement age at all, strictly. So it
65, I think?
Well, that's the age at which you can retire.
Right.
And there's some built-in provisions, but in some contexts, it's very hard even to force people to retire. But the main provision is really about ensuring older workers who may find it harder to compete against a younger worker or so on, or they might be more expensive than a younger worker, that they're not discriminated against simply because they are that older person. So that's really the only difference of right. All other rights, I think they're wrapped into generic right. That it's based on gender, they're based on sort of time, place, context, But I think the only unique older person one is so that you can't be discriminated against. If you're the best person for the job, even if you're 50 or 60, you should get the job. It shouldn't be given to someone just because they're sort of more attractive and younger or something.
All right. Then from a, I can say, outsider's perspective, what message do you think the move by Beijing this time actually sends?
I think there's a big difference between Australia and China in that we've had a older retirement age for much longer, and older people are a more normal feature of the regular labor market. So I don't mean older ladies in helping out in people's homes as an IE or something. And so I think, China's got these sort of funny things about once you turn 35, it's all over in the labor market and all these other sort of cultural things. And there's been a very low retirement age for women, I think in 50 or 55 maybe. And China has it's changed the retirement age to increase that a bit already. And I guess it will increase it again, slowly, incrementally for each different cohort over time. And this is right about the time, between now and 2050, there's going to be about 400 million pensioners at peak time in China. And I guess that's China saying it expects that those people will be contributing to the economy and contributing to society. And that is a new thing. Like there's never been that many pensioners. There's never been that long life expectancy. And China hasn't ever been sort of so rich and modern, at least as it is what it is today, obviously in the past, yes. And I think the government is preparing the groundwork so that when you do hit peak pensioner, since probably at least half of them will be working, even if they're strictly pensioners, then their rights will be protected. So it's sort of getting ahead of itself in a way. It's preparing the ground for this huge older labor force, even if it's an older labor force that will be supporting the very old people, that mutual aid care. I think it's fabulous that this policy has been introduced just after that mutual care policy. What perfect time.
This has been the Chat Lounge. After the break, we'll break down the key provisions of the new framework and what they mean for workers and employers alike. Stay with us.
With a history of 5,000 years, it's no surprise that China has created a fabulous treasury of folk tales.
Once a year, on the 7th day of the 7th month, all the magpies fly up to heaven and form a bridge.
So many amazing worlds to discover.
I want a new palace,
said King Mu of Zhou one day.
Chinese folk tales retold for audiences today. Will you marry me?
He asked. And with little hesitation, she said,
yes.
5,000 years of amazing Chinese folk tales.
My father must not go to war. Someone must take his place.
You'll find Chinese Folk Tales Season 3, wherever you discover your favorite podcasts.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. Let's continue our chat on China's first nationwide framework to protect the rights of overage workers. And now let's walk through the new rules. For the first time, the provisions clearly define who qualifies as an overage worker. Then, Xianyue, who falls within this category, and do you see it as a significant legal breakthrough?
Yeah, I guess my understanding of this overage worker category is those who are, of course, first of all, over the age of retirement, like 60 for women, for some of the women over 55 who decide to retire and to have pension being paid on a monthly basis to their account. And also it covers those who are over the age of 60 or for women, in the case of women for over 55, but decide continue to work. And in the meantime, they do not have access to the pension. So although they reach the age of retirement, they don't have the benefit of our pension available to them and decide to continue to work. So in terms of the breakthrough of this particular new role, I think it covers not only the workers who are over the retirement age and enters into a formal employment contract with the employer, but also include those who have not signed any formal contract, but provide work and services to the employer in return for payment, salary, whatever you call it, wages. So the legal breakthrough is that it addresses an issue that was disregarded or overlooked over the years. That is to decouple legal protection and entitlement of various legal rights with the so-called employment relationship, which usually is to be identified in the form of a employment contract. So that means even those who don't have a have an employment contract, which is the case in many instances, because when an employer hires an overage worker, they usually they don't bother to sign a contract. So that would leave those overage worker in a vulnerable position, because whenever there's a dispute arises, if you go to a labor arbitration or court, the first thing they would ask is whether there's an employment contract. And in those cases, those overage worker, they don't have one. So that is the major vulnerability in terms of legal protection when they have any work-related injury or other ill treatment, etc.
Right. The provisions actually require employers to sign written agreements with overage workers. Xianyue, what key terms must these agreements include, and how do they differ from standard employment contracts? Can you help us understand that?
My understanding is in terms of the key terms for this type of agreement to be entered into between the employer and overage worker, I guess there is no major difference between this type of contract and the regular contract with other employees, such as, for example, the position of the job, the working hours, salary level, holiday and weekend. They are entitled to labor protection to be afforded to the employees, safety and health, work-related injury, insurance coverage, medical care, etc. When it comes to but they do differ from the standard employment contracts. That is, I think, the major difference would be for those who have studied or received pension, and those who still decide to continue to work. The employer do not need to pay for their social security dues. If the overage worker, for example, does not have a pension in spite of their age, due to various reasons, such as failure to meet their fair share of the contribution to the Social Security for sufficient years, minimum 15 years, and then both the worker and the employer have to continue to make payment of the Social Security dues to the government fund. I think that is the major difference between the contract for this type of overage worker and regular worker. And sometimes the overage worker, they don't insist in many instances for a written contract. And that means the employer would be able to sort of exempt you from various other costs. So in that respect, this will lead to a rather complicated situation. So we need to really see what happens. And this situation will definitely further evolve as this new law setting, and the employer and the employee market will take some time to react to this. So we will see what happens next. It's going to be an interesting development in the coming few years.
Sure. And actually...
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Just to draw some parallels to what I observe in Australia in that context, which elements of complexity of older people working. Number one, you do have that aspect of like very qualified older workers who don't really want to retire, but sort of sticking around and working sometimes overall for a lower sort of wage package in the bigger sense, really does offer a bit of unfair competition for working age people who haven't yet had the opportunity to accumulate the same comfortable position as that older, now retirement age worker in terms of paying off their house and having a nice pension and so on. But you've got this older worker who's like, but I'm allowed to work and I can work. And then they sort of make themselves available for implicitly a lower wage. And that brings all this sort of tension. And I have a sense in Australia that it's like, because that today's, say, 60, 70-year-olds in Australia are, they've spent their whole life in a high income country, and many of them are very well educated. So they present a lot of direct competition in ways that many of today's older people in China on average might not, except in big cities. But there's that one angle. And then another angle is not just that they don't have to pay social security, like the employee or the employer, but that by working, there's some allowance of older people in Australia. They're allowed to earn a certain amount before their state pension. So this is a separate from a private pension, but a state pension that is conditional on having a low income or not having an income that you only get because you're older, so not a like unemployment pension. And if you work a bit, then the amount of money you get from the pension will go down. But there are some provisions that allow older people to work. And there are some tensions because it can almost end up that older people are allowed to work forever and pay less tax than younger people. So you have all these provisions. On the one hand, you're protecting the right of older people to be able to work, but you're almost undermining, that if they're paying a lower rate of tax sort of unfairly than younger working age people who may never be as well off as them. So there does become an amazing array of trade-offs. It's quite hard to get the balance right.
So you're saying maybe overage workers enjoy some advantages there, especially when they compare to those who still in their or normal age workers. Would that phenomenon happen in China when it comes to, especially when it comes to some, can I say low-end jobs like cleaning or housekeeping and things like that? Maybe Dr. Li Luan?
Yeah, may I jump in? I
Sure.
think the question is about the composition of these overage workers. So if we're talking about, for example, an old professor versus, for example, an old lady who's working in a rural area versus like an urban worker living in a city. So those are all very different groups. So I think this policy, especially, I think I agree in principle with what Lauren just said, that if a overage worker is currently getting some pension from the government, and on top, that worker is gaining some other labor income through this overage worker protection, this could potentially pose some competition, especially for the younger workers, and especially, for example, in the case of professors or people experts working in a specialized or focused area, this could potentially create some competition for young workers. But I do think that the main focus for this policy right now is to provide the necessary labor income, disposable income, especially for the rural old population, because in many cases, these rural population do not collect any pension at all, or if any, it's very little as maybe 200, 300 yuan per month. So on top of that, if we don't have, good protection for these workers, especially when they, work at, as you mentioned, cleaning or other, labor intensive industries, if they suffer, for example, work injury, if their wages were withheld by the employer, this could potentially put them in a more vulnerable position than they previously are. So I think the goal is to kind of secure the majority of the rural workers, workers who do not have enough pension to support their living standards first. And then I think for the minority, especially for people working in well-educated sector or high-skill sector, I do think it's potentially going to be a challenge. So I think the difference between China and some other countries like United States or potentially Australia is that in those countries, there's no mandatory retirement age. So, but in China, I think this is a mandatorily enforced rule. So once you hit 60 or 65, you are mandatorily unemployed. But in contrary, we oftentimes see in US, I lived in US for over 10 years. So we oftentimes see these very old people still working. They're not treated differently because they're still part of the labor force. There's no mandatory requirement that says, the company has to fire them. So I do think the system is a little bit different to compare with. And not to mention, after, for example, in many cases, the worker is still well capable, especially with long life expectancy. A lot of people, after they reach 60, they're still pretty healthy in terms of being competent in the work they do. So after 60, if they still want to work alongside with their pension, they just have another option on their menu. They could say, I could still enjoy the work, the additional income with more protection. So I think that's kind of the difference in terms of policy and between different countries.
Indeed. And actually, work-related injury protection has long been, one of the biggest concerns for overage workers, as mentioned. But how do the new provisions clarify employers' responsibilities when an overage worker is injured on the job? Xianyue, can you provide some more detailed information there?
Right. Under the previous legal regime in terms of a work-related injury for this older employers, older workers, is basically there was no legal protection for them because, as I said earlier, the previous legal regime on this issue really looks at or emphasize on whether there exists a formal employment relationship that is to be identified in the form of an employment contract. In many of the cases, this does not apply to those overage workers. They don't have one. So in that case, this type of overage workers, they don't have access to the insurance coverage for a work-related injury. I simply don't apply them. They don't have one. So that leaves them in a very vulnerable position. And many of them are, in a very strong financial position. They're not usually well-off people, not wealthy people. Many of them really are from the rural areas where income are very low. They don't have a very high salary before retirement. And that's one of the major reasons and motivating them to find or to continue to work to find additional income. So that creates a lot of problems and challenges, and also lead to some of the social elements of a social unrest, I would say. That creates a lot of tension between the worker and the employers, and generally with the society as well. So according to this new rule that we're discussing today, it addresses specifically of this issue under the new regime that is requiring the employer to have a specific insurance policy made available to this type of overage workers, covering specifically work-related injury, so that whenever there's any work-related injury that happens, those overage workers would equally be able to be covered by those insurances and medical care, for example. And whenever there's any work-related injury, definitely there's some costs it incurred. In some cases, it can be quite substantial. And also, in most cases, it would be beyond the financial capability of those overage workers. This is something I think that is, intended to rectify the previous lacuna that, failed to address this type of risks that would be particularly difficult for those overage workers to address. And the financial capability probably does not allow them to have any this type of work-related injury. So I think this is something a welcoming development.
Then what legal remedies are now available to overage workers if their employers violate the rules by withholding wages or unlawfully terminating an agreement or failing to provide a safe workplace? Sorry, Lauren, we're still at the, I think, a primitive stage of this. Xianyue.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this new regulation have successfully, I think, pinpointed this all those issues that you mentioned that existed previously, which the overage worker do not have access to justice in that respect whenever those type of unfortunate situations happen. Because previously, whenever they address this type of dispute, for example, whenever there's any legal dispute coming to the labor arbitration or the court, the first thing they would try to establish whether there's any employment relationship. If there's none, which in the case of overage workers are, then the difficulty for the overage worker is trying to claim those legal protection that are only available to employees, not to them, which are what we call a one-off service. So basically, the relationship between this overage, the older employees and worker, they're not officially recognized in employment relationship. So that means there's nothing the court, the labor tribunal can do about it. But under the new rule, the employer would now be officially obliged to pay for this type of cost and to also share part of the legal risks because of this type of situation that happens to them. And also, like I said, the employer would be also required to pay the Social Security dues to cover, for example, work-related injuries, and to pay as the law requires, for example, extra hour payment, and also to also afford to the overage workers all those legal entitlements that were not available to them previously.
So there is no any punishment. The employers, all they have to do is to just pay what they should have paid, right? There is no a double that amount, no such regulations.
Well, there are definitely legal consequences, for example, for sure, if they fail to comply with those requirements. For example, as I said, the legal risks, because under the previous legal arrangements, whenever the older worker bringing legal action against this type of employer who fails to provide reasonably sort of a protection to them under the previous legal regime, then the employer are pretty confident that they have a good chance of winning this legal action. But now I think they would be hesitant to continue to sort of continue to fail to comply with this new legal requirement, because the legal risks for them will increase significantly. And that means, the overall cost for them would be much, much higher than under previous legal regime. Of course, there's a consequence for them. So this is something that you have to be aware of.
All right. Then among all the provisions, which ones do you consider the most significant or groundbreaking? This question goes to you all. Maybe Xianyue first?
Yeah, I think there are a few. First of all, this requirement for the employer in the future, or starting from now, to afford or to give legal protection or insurance coverage to all types of work-related injury. And also, the Social Security coverage would also be provided to those overage workers who don't have access to Social Security and to pension. And also the sort of legal benefits that are available to other regular workers would also now be made available to those overage workers.
Right, Leland?
Yes, I think in terms of my point of view, I think this decoupling of labor protections from the existence of a standard labor relationship is very groundbreaking. So what it means is that in the case of overage workers, conceptually, they're not part of what we define as part of the official labor force, but this regulation give them this labor protection that they needed. So I think in terms of the mandatory work injury insurance, in practical terms, this is also going to matter, especially for the overage workers who are more likely to be more vulnerable to these work injuries. So I think I've been thinking about Lawrence's point. I think about the competition between young and old workers. So I think the status quo in China's case is that a lot of these overage workers, especially, for example, in hotels, in restaurants, in cleaning, in some of the service sectors, it's not to say before the regulation they're not employed. They are employed, but sometimes under more, arbitrary contracts, under more unfair treatment. But this regulation is basically saying, right now, if you're hiring any overage worker, you have to treat them, you have to give them the labor protections and the work injury insurance that they deserve. So in other cases, instead of saying this lowers the labor cost for employers, in some senses, this kind of increases the mandatory cost when it comes to overage workers. It's not to say it's a disadvantage for these workers, because if you want to hire them, you have to provide them with all the protections. But I think when it comes to the trade-off between the young workers and old workers, this could go in either direction. So for employers, especially for employers who needed the worker to engage in labor-intensive work, especially working in long hours, they may think twice about, should I hire this overage worker and not provide the work injury insurance versus maybe I can employ someone else, or I hire the same person, but I provide the insurance to this person. So I think the trade-off, after everything has become a written agreement, every requirement need to be enforced. I think this actually gives more transparency about, who gets paid and how much is going to be paid. And when it comes to employers, it's actually going to be to have, the decision making, the trade-off is actually going to be even clearer.
China's new rules don't just affect domestic workers. For the first time, they also extend protections to eligible foreign overage workers. Why does that matter, and what signal does it send? That's coming up after the break at the Chat Lounge. Don't go away.
From the refreshing cup of tea that starts your morning, to the paper that you write on, the roots of many familiar parts of modern life can be traced back to ancient ideas.
2 crates of tea dumped the whole thing straight into the ice. Rice even served as currency in 794. A new paper mill was founded in the Abbasid.
Across mountains, deserts, and oceans, these creations shaped the world then and continue to influence all of us today. Join us on Made in Ancient China and discover how ideas born millennia ago became some of the world's greatest treasures.
Welcome to Made in Ancient China. We hope you enjoyed this journey. May your thoughts...
Made in Ancient China brings you stories of human ambition, inspiration, and connection. Now available on all major podcast platforms.
Welcome back. We continue our chat on China's new framework for overage workers. Actually, it's for the first time the provisions explicitly cover eligible foreign overage workers. And what does it tell us about China's broader approach to attracting and retaining international talent then? I think Leland mentioned this. It probably can help, China to attract more global talent here. But in reality, will it work? Maybe Lauren?
I agree with his point on when I first saw it, I thought it was a bit sort of odd. I was like, wow, that's distinguishing one section of the labor force from the rest. Now, certainly in physically demanding jobs, older workers might have special needs of, more back support or so on. But and perhaps China has been looking to Germany and Japan and South Korea, where I think there are many more provisions because there's so many older people working on the manufacturing floor and so on. So in terms of that international point, one thing that is interested in, there's not many cases of it in a bigger scheme, but where older workers are forced to retire in the West, they still are extremely capable. Some of them, especially university professors, like top university professors who, are forced to retire, they're increasingly going to Chinese universities if there's a window for them to be a more international professor, who teaches in English, for example, or applies their particular expertise. But why those people would need, they're not doing sort of hard labor, they're not on the manufacturing floor. But, there is that aspect. There'll be a lot of talented old people floating around the West, and various countries may introduce mechanisms to tap their latent talents, and maybe there'll be provisions for that also.
Right. Yeah, I was about to say that, what Leland mentioned, the various situation or scenarios in China, it's just a situation with some Chinese characteristics. We are in a different development stage, especially when compared to countries like Australia or Japan or other developed countries. Then Lauren, or from your personal perspective, given that, overage workers' rights are better protected or can be better protected after this, do you yourself have any intention to work in China? I know you've worked in China before, right? Am I right?
Yeah, yes, you are correct. I have.
Right. Or would you consider that, after retirement, or probably move to China and work here?
I mean, I would. I would consider working in China now or anytime. So, once I was in that category, if China offered me a great job, of course, I would take it up. So, yeah, I would. China is certainly getting more flexible on retirement age. And by the time I get to that category, it will probably be even more so. So I would indeed welcome them to offer me such a job when I get to that age.
Right. But Leland, as we know that overage workers here in China, actually, before the provisions take effect, they are in a very different position, right? Most of them will have to, or employers will stop hiring them or cease their contract after they reach that age. But things could be different after this provisions take effect, right?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to top experts or professionals like Lauren, in universities or in institutions, we constantly see these top experts being hired by Chinese institutes. I think one of the recent Nobel laureates in economics were hired by the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics. It's another example. So I think when it comes to work, especially in these retired professionals area, what it used to be, the status quo was like people have to fight a little bit for this privilege of being hired again after retirement, especially within a institute or a research university. And a lot of these contracts are really informal, really flexible. So all the bargaining powers are within the employer. If you're not satisfied with your work, if you're not satisfied with your contract, or if you're delayed payment, for example, or you have work injury, you really don't have anywhere to petition. So right now, I think, at least from my understanding of the law, I think in terms of disputes, the workers still have some role to kind of, whether they could go to, for example, the labor inspection or labor arbitration facilities, or they could file a lawsuit in court. And as Xianyue has mentioned, they will now have a higher chance of winning. They could also, file complaint with the authorities. So I think they have more legal ground to protect themselves. And I think if we have become more flexible about the age and also the status of the employment. I think for retirees, it's not just about the salary or income, especially for retired professionals, experts. It's also about dignity. So we don't want to be those professionals don't want to be understood as the employers is giving them a pity or showing them some respect, and out of that giving them some salary. I think it's a continued work relationship, and it's based on expertise. It's based on equal exchange of basically I give you my expertise, but you give me the fair treatment and the competitive price for my service. So I think this is going to bring more dignity, more also I think higher predictability for this labor market, for this segment of the labor market.
This is the whole point of the new provisions. Then for the employers or companies that would hire retired professionals or technical experts, Xianyue, what legal advice would you give them?
I guess this is quite a significant shift of the regulation in this respect. So I believe the employers nowadays need to really update their sort of understanding of the labor law, which is quite a different legal regime anymore compared with the previous legal arrangement. And whenever they hire and bring on board some of the older workers, or if some of them might be from technical side of the industry, and some of them are not necessarily always physically demanding workforce, but some of them could be like really professors, for example, technicians, experts in various industries, etc. So when they bring on board these overage workers, they need to be aware that the legal requirement nowadays is quite sensitive and quite different from what it were before. And there are legal risks if they fail to comply with the new requirement. Although in practice, I guess there's a lot of reluctance, I guess, on the side of the employer, because they previously, sometimes they prefer to bring on board some of the overage workers because of their expertise, because of their experiences, because of sometimes of their networking capabilities, etc., in social contact, for example. Previously, they would have a preference for this type of employees. But in the future, whenever there's any legal dispute that might arise, I think the employer would be in a much disadvantaged position compared with previous situation. So they have to be aware of this type of potential legal risk and really make adjustments to their internal policies, to the general practice of employment. And they need additional training, I guess, for their human resources department staff as well. So this is a new regime and a new sort of a legal landscape. And they have to be prepared for this type of change and the potential outcome of legals if they fail to catch up, on time and to update their kind of compliance policies furthermore.
Right. And I think some of you already mentioned this. Some people worry that, stronger worker protections could raise labor costs. That's one aspect of this, and reduce their willingness to hire older or overage workers. Does the new framework strike the right balance between protecting workers and maintaining labor market flexibility? What's your evaluation?
Yeah, so I think it's not a mandatory requirement about, you have to hire this amount of overage workers. So I think overall it gives businesses more choice. So I do think their concern is understandable, especially for the low margin service sectors. So basically this framework essentially raises the minimum wage, raises the floor, right? Because you have to give them more protection. You have to ensure their work injury insurance, and also give them all the labor contract that they deserve. But I think when you think about the benefits of some experienced old workers, not necessarily in the service sector, but also potentially in manufacturing sector as well. So you think about their reliability, the technical knowledge and expertise that they amassed over their long career. You could have them to mentor new employees, and also in some roles you don't really need any training costs because these are all very, very experienced professionals. So when it comes to the benefits of employing these experienced workers, the companies basically now have a more predictable and more transparent framework to kind of hire them without any legal concerns or without any unpredictability. So I do think, in the future, having these clear rules can actually reduce the cost in the long run, because there's not going to be as many disputes once the rule is clear. And in terms of reputation, if a company is known to hire these old professionals or overage workers, it could also give them a boost in terms of their reputation. So I do think that having a well-designed policy is going to make the older worker market more, transparent. Now, and once you have a more mature labor market for older workers, it's actually a more sustainable future.
Indeed, but another question is about the implementation. While the new provisions provide stronger legal protections, effective implementation remains a key challenge, actually, here in China. In practice, many overage workers who experience rights violations may lack the time or resources or capacity to defend themselves effectively. So, Xianyue, what additional measures should the government take to ensure these rights are not only recognized on paper, but effectively enforced in practice?
Yes, that is a good point, I think, that we all need to be aware about. Given their senior age and the vulnerability, enforcement and implementation in practice could always be a challenge. So for that purpose, I guess we probably should think of, establishing some pro bono type of work to be provided, legal assistance to be provided to those overage workers. And this could be a helpful, useful arrangement to supplement to the legal protection on paper and make it more effective and accessible to such a disadvantaged group of workers. Many of them, I guess, are, although many of the overage workers, they are quite experienced, quite well-paid in the previous jobs, etc. But many of those, I think a large chunk of the overage worker, that this piece of a role is intended to address those really are in disadvantage, coming from a financially disadvantaged group of people. So there definitely remains many things need to be done, many measures to be taken by the government, the legislature, and enforcement agencies apart from this piece of regulation. So, like, for example, the more effective government oversight, whenever there's any dispute, a appropriate, I would say, a legal mechanism need to be introduced. For example, whenever those overaged workers coming to a litigation or an arbitration, I guess we probably should think of the reverse of the burden of proof, because when you being a claimant, when you want to establish something, so being an employee, being an overaged worker, or someone who probably didn't have a contract or employment contract, I guess this can be burdensome for those claimants. So the reverse of the burden of proof could be a very helpful arrangement for those disadvantaged group of people. And for example, also to think of an expedited procedure for resolving such type of dispute, because if we have a prolonged process, that can be costly and can be financially inaccessible to those overaged workers. So there are a whole lot of different mechanisms and measures that can be taken in order to respond to address this type of challenges for the overaged workers.
Right. Lauren, are there any lessons or experiences that we can learn from maybe your country or other countries? I know you lived and worked in Germany. Those countries like Japan, Germany, Singapore, they also have introduced policies to encourage employment beyond retirement age. So are there any international best practices China could draw upon?
About best practices or employing older people for the sake of it. To some extent, I mean, I agree in the conversation points that came up about developing a brand of inclusion, when there's 300 million older consumers, depending on what you're selling, it could be tremendously profitable to have a very elderly friendly labor brand. And once you get a certain share of people over 60, over 65, some jobs seem to sort of shift over anyway. So it's not a policy of inclusion. It's just a policy of pragmatism. So, for example, in Germany, 35 years ago, where you did have people working in shops, obviously lots of jobs have been replaced by automation, but where you still, for example, at supermarkets have people working on a cash register and so on, now those jobs are almost exclusively done by people who could or would be retired. They're in their 60s or even their 70s. Whereas 30 years ago, they all would have been done by people who were like, 16 after, or, in their early 20s or something. So I don't even think it's strictly about including older people as much as it is about responding to a structural shift in the composition of the labor market. And I think these change in rights is really, it's almost less about the rights of those people, though that's important, and more about just setting up frameworks so that as that labor market composition shifts, everything works smoothly. Because yes, it does in principle increase the cost of employing people, but actually it doesn't overall once you take into account elevated, incomes, because you can employ a much wider spectrum of the labor market. And that means more people can consume, more people can participate, stay engaged. It really, I don't think it is a cost. I think it's a benefit even to employers in terms of demand and in terms of having healthy, happy workers. So I don't know if there are, I know in Germany and Japan, they've really fostered use of sort of technology that helps people working in factories to bend over and pick up heavy things, if they don't have younger people now. But those are all pragmatism as much as rights. Like if you don't have a lot of young workers, you just simply have to adapt. And I think that's what China's doing. So I think that it's as much about rights, much about pragmatism as about rights. But I don't have any kind of specific individual gems.
Thanks anyway. Li Lun, maybe last bit comments from you?
Yeah, so I'll be brief. So I think in terms of anti-age discrimination enforcement, I think that's an area where we can pay more attention to. I think China is already doing better in that. So it used to be, also Lauren has mentioned that there used to be a stigma around the age of 35. So if you're a programmer, for example, over the age of 35, so you basically have higher pressure of being fired or replaced by programmers under the age of 35, especially in the past. But I do think that, in the future, the trade-off is not between programmers under or above 35, it's about programmers versus vibe coding, right? Programmers versus AI. So I think how to basically first strengthen our anti-age discrimination enforcement, and second, give the retired professionals the required skills training, for example, training surrounding the usage of AI, because that's kind of the fundamental force that's going to replace human labor regardless of age. So whether you're 22-year-old or 62 years old, the competition is all there. So how to give, but the real difference is that overage or older population tends to learn slightly slower than the younger population when it comes to new technology. So how to give them this lifelong learning framework and also kind of match them with more age-friendly jobs. For example, they could be perfect nannies, or they could be really good cleaners or in other positions. So I think how to basically create this good matching system and also protection system to make sure that people with the right human capital are matched into the right position and occupations. I think it's going to be the next step for our development.
Look forward to the fruit, if you will, of the new provisions. And with that, we come to the end of this session. Many thanks to Dr. Li Lun from Peking University, Dr. Lauren Johnston from AustChina Institute, Melbourne, and Mr. Bai Xianyue from Grandall Law Firm, Tianjin office, for your time and insights. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop us a line at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tuyun. Thank you for listening. Join us again for more Chat at the Chat Lounge next week. Till then, take care.
I cannot marry you while your mother regards me.
Step into the world of timeless elegance with Mrs. Spring Fragrance, a captivating audiobook by Edith Eaton, read by Man Ling.
Because the green leaf still clings to the bough.
Experience the lively yet complex lives in Chinese American communities at the turn of the 20th century, as Edith Eaton's delicate prose weaves together themes of tradition, change, love, and identity.
Forget all that belongs to the joy of life.
Follow the journey of Mrs. Spring Fragrance and witness the struggles and fights of those living on a rapidly changing exotic land while holding on to their cultural traditions, or more importantly, to their
He
identities.
could hardly believe that his daughter was seriously opposed to becoming the wife of such a good-looking, prosperous young merchant as Wang Ling.
Join Books and Beyond for Mrs. Spring Fragrance. Let the stories come to life in your imagination. Subscribe to Books and Beyond for free on your favorite podcast platforms or log on to radio.cgtn.com for more.